The Pale Knight, having received the blessing from the Pale Knight to engage in the functions of surveillance KKK contracts, exponentially spread malice and hate as their chaotic, evil nature dictates. And to these ends, the generations, such as the function of possession for the position of inconvenience, as deals with these devils, engages in the exponential mechanisms of engaging in the collapse of the legal structure, and thus the mechanism of insurgency, and thus the mechanism of the use of lawfare and the use of abuse of every aspect of the thing until the structure itself collapses. And to these ends, the mechanism of the hyperacceleration of fraudulent policy materializes the function of fake virtue signals, and thus the mechanism of nonsense positions which generates harassment exponential, and to the end that it becomes the expited function of nonsense off of false morality. It is then increased to an extraordinary extent by its defrauding of the system which it has infiltrated, by those who make these deals, which they believe to be with devils, materializes the function of the systematic increase of prisons, and thus the mechanism of convictions off of fraud, as the courts not being able to process the function of what's going on willfully by the understanding of everyone participating in the court who is willfully defrauding it, engages in the collapse of the society in these D&D type campaigns, and thus the mechanism of destroying society off of fake virtue becomes the status quo of these demons. And to the extent that they actively have possession, they get to treat the participant as entirely under their control as a familiar, and thus the mechanism of shock and grasp on them at any aspect of their person, as long as the connection is gone, actively has the connection with each other in order to give the particular interest for the amusement of those who are making the deals, and thus the exchange of those who have devoted themselves into total objective evil would then dumbstab themselves in order to engage in the higher luxuries of lack of competition and theft, and thus the mechanism of white trash, however you might imagine it, normally perceived by the social understanding to be the most accelerated into that society by virtue of these techniques, then might perceive to itself the assertion of the ability to dumbstat it even further below, and thus the mechanism of being able to replace one of the Pale Knights with themselves as they sell their soul to it, and thus the mechanism engages in creating the dumbstat, dropping their intelligence from a 10 to an 8, and thus their strength from a 12 to a 14. And to the extent that they have done this, this acquires secret advantages which is not to be discussed yet. And to the extent that this might happen, the dump stat does not require the person to have anything intelligent to say, but rather the function of loud noises, as the function of harassment is its own end, and thus the perpetuation of saying nonsense, such as the garbage in comment sections, perpetuates the infinite variation of nonsense at low intelligence, so that anyone according to the communist tactics of struggling, who, having persistently been beaten over the head with this nonsense, might cave in and ask repentance from the state over the thing that they have nothing to do with, which would actively be reinforced by the illusions surrounding the person, crafted by the Pale Knights doing their KKK contracts, as the exponential increase of trauma against the society by the greater and greater normalization of the hate crimes. The people being worn out by these possessions and the perpetual harassments actively, invisibly affects them as they systemically have the compulsion to making the wrong choices, and thus the mechanism of an amusement mechanism for those who would participate in the thing in order to make the advancement, the kind of humiliations that they would want to express to those that they were jealous of, or some other mechanism along those lines, generates indefinite entertainment, and thus an unending revenue generated for those systems until the inevitable collapse, as the funding specifically increases the war efforts against the infected community by the demon virus. As all the demon lords involved in the situation cooperate with each other in the systemic function of the military campaign against the societies under Frazogulu's illusions that dictates for each of them that they are in fact the leading, most important of them all, and thus the others are only incidentally there, into a well-crafted tapestry which would confuse anyone who was not diligently investigating the entire thing, and even giving a little bit of time in order to pay attention to something else might make you perpetually lost in this active cycling system, which requires extreme concentration in order to keep up with the ever-changing, shifting illusion. Now, to many in that society who would not have done these types of investigations and kept that kind of concentration or maintained the prerequisites, the solutions to the traumas happening around the society that they're able to see as side effects clearly needed to make these contracts in order to do the possessions so that they could put order into the life, which is actively collapsing onto itself. And to the extent that that happens, there is a lesser of two evils effect. And to this extent, the presumption of good is then dissolved immediately into the evil as they are ritually corrupted into the position that they have to do more and more compromising things by the demoniacs. And thus, the mechanism becomes, in reality, the act of compulsion of those who've made these deals to have to pay, and for the possessions to be banned, and thus the action of the surveillance neutralized in its entirety, allowing for the rehabilitation of all of its particular victims until the matured position can go back to normal, which is the person's normal and not the illusion's normal, as returning them to the illusion just goes back to the things that everyone is pretending is outrageous and offensive, and in some cases it very much so is, as the unchained position derived by those who believe that they cannot be punished for their crimes or would not be caught for their crimes becomes more and more selfish as it forms into the overarching structure of the white supremacist communism, as the system of distributions of these black market offenses normalizes as its own series function replacing the normal economy with itself until the original economy, not just the one from its free market, but the diluted one by the infection, actively becomes less relevant than the exchanges for the crime and its laundering structures, and its perpetual restructuring of the system as the inferior are promoted to the superior positions, as the structures collapse by virtue of failures in the saving throes for those positions, as the system of having replaced their betters left them without the capability of sustaining the things they needed their betters to do, but would prefer to not acknowledge, as that would require that they systematically acknowledge that those who belong there, and that it due respect owed to them is in fact not misplaced, is not a superimposed position upon someone who is retarded in their view, as the mechanism of the stats necessary to sustain the thing is systematically different than theirs, and thus their stats, having been derived for their interest, has its own cultural objective, as opposed to the things necessary in the refinements to accomplish the mission of each office's responsibilities. And while it's easier to attack their superiors, it is objectively to be said that they aren't capable of doing the job instead, and the mechanism of having not been able to do the job instead have merely seen something on a pedestal and are shooting at something higher than itself, and thus the mechanism of the perpetual contempt inherent to the positions by virtue constructed into its hierarchy has at it its own illusion, an illusion by Frazu in order to turn the system against itself and hyper-accelerate the function. Now, to this extent, the abuses of the hierarchy are real. The systems, especially after corruption, are insufferable, and the mechanisms without the infection by the demoniacs becomes a nuisance from many, and to the extent that it is a nuisance, it must be understood in its proper exchanges, as these positions are designed to undermine the existence of the structure, which fundamentally has a way of revealing things. The people who get drunk become happy or angry because they are happy or angry. They just reveal things. Money is the same way. Power is the same way. It just reveals who the person already is. If the person was happy, they'll be happy with it. If the person was angry, they'll be angry with it. And thus the position, having had the position filled by someone who's refined themselves to be capable of stabilizing it, is themselves in the thing and all of the traumas that made it, and thus will have its own defects before the function of additional tampering, which is then hyper-accelerated by the infection of the demon lords. To this extent, it is actively opposed, as the increased function of those that would suck the life out of you, such as corporate life, engages in the hyper-acceleration of the Sheperds. Thus, the vampiric nature of them engages in the exponential expansion of the destruction of the society by its infection, and to the extent that they do so, the parties become exponentially in danger, as each and every one of them are put into a position that those that they accelerate as the most important becoming delusional in the support, as opposed to delusional in opposition, to engage in the function of making themselves overwhelmingly vulnerable. And the shepherds, similar to the shepherds of flocks of sheep, are there to devour their flocks, and thus engage in the ritual subversions as a fake Christianity or some other type of thing engages in the undermining, in the devotion to the Canaanite gods. And to the extent that they do so, the Urshalagi, bringers of judgment, will devote themselves to devouring your succulent energies, and in its opposition generates the capability of the solar cities to be able to oppose them in their systematic missions. And to the extent that they do so, those advanced forms taken in order to evolve the vampires who are with the Solar City to be able to enter into the possibility of the light, become exponentially compounded on themselves as their barbaric tendencies, which being led to the advancements normally characterization of the activities of the vampire, being able to enter even into the light and not be stunned by holy water or some other holy relic, is not bound to the limitations prescribed normally to the vampire, but would suck your blood either way, and thus the donations from the city to feed it satiates its hunger while it engages in the missions to fight the others, and thus the vampire hunters engage in these contests against each other as the amorphous shape-shifting function perpetuates their capability of infiltration at all levels, but never take for granted the actual functioning advantage of having placed themselves so keenly. Now, Pale Knight has Pale Knights, and the Pale Knights, as a warlock pact with Pale Knight, have an extension of her capabilities and powers thriving through them, and thus the mechanism of the automation of these contracts, due diligence engaging in the express shocking nature of those agreements, having bound themselves to it, will eventually be consumed, and thus seek a personal audience, but would, in order to acquire a personal audience, have to find a replacement and relevant status, having accelerated themselves into the system in order to have the honor of seeing the noble, the honor of talking with their superior god, talking with those who, having asserted the higher status, being more attractive, are actively allured with the things that are just out of reach, and thus must collect to itself its status, and has abandoned all wealth in pursuit of this nobility, that they might be worthy to speak face to face. And so the possessions will continue. And with the possession comes the muting of the target and the lesser of two evils, or the consequences of refusing the greater of two evils, and its perpetual horrific agony, unless brave adventurers try and solve the problem by killing the Pale Knight minutes, but that would be deadly, as that would require them to fight the entire system that's been infected in its state of delusion. Now, it, being possessed itself, is not the guilty party, but is just as dangerous, and thus the mechanism, such as expressed in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise towards the end of the movies. I forget which one specifically, but the act of the person being possessed means you don't want to hurt the person, but you do need the possession to stop. So, how do you want to shock it without causing minimum, without causing permanent damages, or rather causing as few damages as possible that would be permanent, and thus the mechanism of temporary damage, temporary inconveniences, and its like, without being itself the problem it pretends to fix. What can you, a silly, foolish humanoid, do except to mock them, to make acknowledging the stupidity unavoidable, to make acknowledging the errors unavoidable? What, outside of vicious mockery, even is there? And thus the mechanism of making it too unavoidable by public pressure to make the changes non-violently would be the most ideal solution, but that would require collective collaboration to that end of generating the change, which requires you to convince everyone who's participated and not participated into saving their own life from this horrific standard which has been normalized throughout the system, requiring the influence to have defeated these level 16 charismas in their own game.